Almost every major conflict zone in today's Middle East sits on land that was part of the Ottoman Empire a little over a century ago. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Yemen, Libya. That is not a coincidence. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I, the powers that carved it up did not build stable replacements. They drew lines, installed rulers, made promises they contradicted, and left. What they created were states without the foundations to hold together under pressure, and a region full of groups who felt, with justification, that they had been promised things that were never delivered. A century later, those decisions are still producing consequences. Wars, failed states, sectarian conflicts, refugee crises, and the rise and fall of extremist movements can all be traced, at least in part, back to what the Ottoman Empire was, how it ended, and what replaced it. But to understand the collapse, you have to understand what was there before it fell, because the Ottoman Empire was not simply a precursor to today's problems. It was one of the most durable, sophisticated, and underestimated political systems in human history, and understanding it properly changes how you see almost everything that came after. The Ottoman Empire lasted from roughly 1299 to 1922. At its height in the 16th and 17th centuries, it controlled southeastern Europe, Anatolia, the Caucasus, North Africa, and the Arab Middle East. It was one of the largest empires the world had ever seen, and one of the longest lived. Its capital was Constantinople, conquered from the Byzantine Empire in 1453 by Sultan Roman II. That conquest was one of the defining moments of the medieval world. It ended the last remnant of the Roman Empire. It shifted the center of the Islamic world westward, and it gave the Ottomans a city that sat at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, controlling the straits between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. The empire was, by design and necessity, a multi-ethnic and multi-religious entity at its peak. It governed Arabs, Turks, Greeks, Armenians, Serbs, Bulgarians, Jews, Albanians, Kurds, and dozens of other peoples. Managing that diversity was not incidental to the Ottoman system, it was central to it. The millet system organized non-Muslim populations into self-governing communities defined by religion. Orthodox Christians, Armenian Christians, Jews, and Catholics each had their own legal jurisdictions, their own schools, their own internal governance. The Ottoman state extracted taxes and military service and, in exchange, largely left internal religious and communal affairs alone. It was not equality in the modern sense. Non-Muslims paid additional taxes and faced certain legal disadvantages. But it was a framework for coexistence that allowed enormously diverse populations to live under one administration for centuries. The empire was also a major economic and cultural force. Ottoman Constantinople was one of the great cities of the world. Ottoman courts produced significant advances in architecture, astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. The empire sat across the trade routes connecting Europe to Asia, and it extracted enormous wealth from that position. What is often missed in Western historical narratives is how formidable the Ottomans were for most of their existence. They besieged Vienna twice, in 1529 and 1683. They controlled the eastern Mediterranean for generations. European powers spent centuries trying to contain them, and for most of that time, containment was the best they could manage. The decline, when it came, was real, but it was slow, complicated, and driven by forces both internal and external. By the 18th century, the empire was losing ground. Military technology in Europe was advancing faster than the Ottomans could match. The trade routes that had made Constantinople wealthy were increasingly bypassed by Atlantic Sea routes that the Ottomans did not control. The administrative system that had managed such a vast territory was showing signs of strain. Provincial governors were accumulating autonomous power. Reform efforts met institutional resistance, and the finances of the empire were under increasing pressure. The 19th century brought a new challenge: nationalism. The idea that every people deserved its own state arrived in the Balkans and spread rapidly among the empire's Christian populations. Greece won independence in the 1820s with British, French, and Russian backing. Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Montenegro followed over the following decades. Each time the empire lost territory in Europe, it also lost tax revenues and population, making the next loss more likely. The great powers of Europe, Britain, France, Russia, and Austria-Hungary, called the Ottoman Empire the sick man of Europe and spent the 19th century maneuvering over what would happen to its territories when it finally collapsed. Russia wanted access to the Bosphorus Straits and influence over Orthodox Christian populations. Britain wanted to protect its route to India and prevent Russian expansion. France had interests in North Africa and among Catholic communities in Lebanon. Their competing ambitions made every Ottoman crisis an international crisis. The empire tried to reform. The Tanzimat reforms of the mid-19th century attempted to modernize the legal and administrative system, extend civil rights to non-Muslim subjects, and create a more centralized state. The efforts were genuine but incomplete. They satisfied neither the conservatives who thought they went too far nor the reformers who thought they didn't go far enough. By the late 19th century, a group of military officers and intellectuals known as the Young Turks had concluded that more radical change was needed. They seized power in 1908, initially with broad support across the empire's different communities. But as the empire faced defeat in the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, losing almost all of its remaining European territory, the Young Turk leadership became increasingly nationalist, increasingly Turkish in orientation, and increasingly willing to use violence to secure what they saw as the empire's survival. This is the context for one of the darkest chapters of late Ottoman history. During World War I, the Ottoman government, now controlled by a Young Turk triumvirate, ordered the deportation of the Armenian population of Anatolia. What followed was the systematic killing and forced displacement of Armenians on a scale that most historians, and the majority of genocide scholars, classify as genocide. Estimates of the death toll range from several 100,000 to over 1 million. The Ottoman government and its successor, the Turkish Republic, have disputed this characterization. The debate over recognition remains a live political issue in multiple countries today. The Ottomans entered World War I on the side of Germany and the Central Powers, in part because the British and French had been unwilling to offer security guarantees, and in part because the new leadership saw the war as an opportunity to recover lost territory and modernize with German help. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. By 1918, the empire had been defeated on multiple fronts. British forces controlled Palestine, Mesopotamia, and much of the Arab world. The capital was under Allied occupation. The empire was finished. What happened next shaped the modern Middle East more than almost any other event of the 20th century. Even before the war ended, Britain and France had been secretly planning the division of Ottoman Arab territories. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, named after the British and French diplomats who negotiated it, drew a map of spheres of influence across the region. France would control Syria and Lebanon. Britain would control Iraq, Palestine, and Jordan. The agreement was kept secret from the Arab leaders. Britain had been encouraging to revolt against the Ottomans with promises of independence. Those promises, made most famously through the correspondence between British High Commissioner Henry McMahon and Sharif Hussein of Mecca, were vague enough to be interpreted multiple ways. Arab leaders understood them as a commitment to a unified Arab state across most of the Arab world. The British, in practice, meant something much more limited. When the war ended and the Sykes-Picot framework was implemented, Arab leaders felt, with considerable justification, that they had been deceived. Then came the Balfour Declaration of 1917, in which the British government expressed support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. It also stated that nothing should be done to prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. How these two commitments could be simultaneously honored was not explained. It has not been resolved since. The borders that emerged from the post-war settlement, formalized in the 1920 Treaty of Esres and the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne for Turkey, and through League of Nations mandates for the Arab territories, were drawn with varying degrees of care for the populations living inside them. Iraq was assembled from three former Ottoman provinces: Mosul in the north, Baghdad in the center, Basra in the south, that had significant Kurdish, Sunni Arab, and Shia Arab populations respectively, with no particular history of operating as a single unit. Syria and Lebanon were separated in ways that served French administrative preferences. The Kurdish people, who had been promised some form of autonomy in the Treaty of Esfres, received nothing in the final settlement and were divided across Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran, where they remain today. In Turkey itself, Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, led a military campaign that defeated the Greek invasion of Anatolia, expelled remaining Allied forces, and established the Republic of Turkey in 1923. He then implemented one of the most rapid and radical programs of secularization and modernization in the 20th century. The Caliphate, the Ottoman sultans' claim to religious authority over all Sunni Muslims, was abolished in 1924. For the first time in centuries, the Sunni Muslim world had no recognized caliph. That absence has mattered. Various movements and regimes have since claimed the authority that disappeared with it. Trace any major crisis in the modern Middle East far enough back and you reach the Ottoman collapse. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is rooted directly in British Mandatory Palestine, a territory the British administered after the Ottoman defeat, made contradictory promises about, and then handed to the United Nations in 1947 when the contradictions proved unmanageable. The UN partition plan, the 1948 war, and everything that followed grew from that moment. The Iraq that the United States invaded in 2003 was the same artificial construction assembled from three Ottoman provinces in the 1920s. The sectarian tensions between Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish communities that made post-invasion Iraq so difficult to stabilize were not created by the invasion, though the invasion dramatically inflamed them. They were structural features of a state whose borders were never designed around its internal realities. The Syrian civil war, which began in 2011, unfolded in a country where the French mandate had deliberately empowered minority communities, including Alawites, the sect of Bashar al-Assad's family, as a tool of colonial administration. The consequences of that choice echoed forward for nearly a century. The Kurdish question remains one of the most significant unresolved issues in the region. Kurds are the largest ethnic group in the world without a recognized nation-state. They live in significant numbers in Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran. Their political aspirations bring them into conflict with all four governments. The fact that they were left stateless in 1923 when the post-Ottoman map was finalized is a direct cause of conflicts that are still ongoing. The rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which underlies so much of the regional instability in the contemporary Middle East, also connects to the Ottoman collapse. The Ottomans were Sunni Muslims and claimed authority over the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. When that authority disappeared, it created a competition for Islamic leadership that has never been fully settled. Saudi Arabia's promotion of Sunni Wahhabist ideology and Iran's promotion of Shia revolutionary Islam are, in part, a continuation of that competition. Even the tension between secular nationalism and political Islam in countries across the region connects to the Ottoman collapse. Ataturk's forcible secularization of Turkey was one response to that collapse. Political Islam, the argument that Muslim-majority societies should be governed according to Islamic principles, is, in part, a response to the failure of post-Ottoman secular nationalism to deliver stability, prosperity, and dignity. The Ottoman Empire is not a distant historical artifact. It is the missing context for an enormous amount of what is happening in the world right now. This does not mean that everything happening today is simply the Ottoman Empire's fault, or Britain and France's fault, or that the peoples of the Middle East are somehow passive victims of decisions made a century ago with no agency of their own. That is too simple, and it is its own form of condescension. What it does mean is that the map the modern Middle East inherited was designed by people who did not live there and did not fully understand, or much care about, what the people who did live there needed. Borders were drawn for imperial convenience. Promises were made and broken. Populations were divided and minorities were manipulated, and then the powers that drew those lines largely left and expected the results to be stable. They were not stable. They are not stable now. Understanding the Ottoman Empire, what it was, how it governed, why it fell, and what replaced it, does not solve those problems, but it makes them comprehensible. It explains why certain borders are contested, why certain groups feel historically wrong, why certain conflicts keep recurring despite repeated attempts to resolve them. History does not repeat itself automatically, but when the foundations are flawed, the cracks keep appearing in the same places. The Ottoman Empire ended in 1922. In the most important ways, the world is still figuring out what to put in its place.